A final dichotomy that we're going to consider is that of subjectivity versus objectivity. Now, again, qualitative research is often presented, and primarily because of its philosophical roots in constructivism, as being something that deals with primarily subjective phenomena. Whereas quantitative research is often pitted as as handling primarily objective phenomena. There is often this kind of mistake that people make, that because we can apply numbers to something, that we are inherently dealing with something that is an objective phenomena. But I'll give you a simple example that kind of highlights the folly of thinking in this particular way. So let's take, for example, some sort of aspect of someone's phenomenological experience. So I've used this term phenomenology before in the workshops, and by it, it's a term that comes from a philosopher named Edmund Husserl, whose philosophy of phenomenology essentially describes the lived experience, the subjective lived experience of others. So it is that kind of fundamental empirical experience that people have and go about experiencing. And this is something that's inherently hard to understand. I've mentioned again before as well, the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a famous essay called What It's Like to Be a Bat that describes the inherent difficulty of trying to understand, whilst we can observe, what others do and things like that, and we can gain some kind of objective knowledge about, the behaviours and things like that they exhibit, there's some fundamental inaccessibility of what it is like to be them, so we can't necessarily directly gain observation of their phenomenological experiences. However, other philosophers such as Daniel Dennett would argue that that doesn't mean that we can't produce knowledge of those experiences. So Dennett's approach, known as heterophenomenology, sees instead just that the individual themselves is the measurement tool by which we go about trying to capture data about their subjective experiences. And just like any other measurement tool, there can be error involved. They may lie, they may be inaccurate, they may even be unable to actually access that subjective state that they're experiencing. In fact, Dennett has a great quote where he says, "You are not authoritative about what is happening to you, but only what seems to be happening to you. And with that, we are giving you total dictatorial authority over the account of how it seems to be you and what it is like to be you." Now, the example I want to use is some example of trying to understand and gain knowledge through some methodological approach about the phenomenology that someone experiences. So we could take, for example, an area that I'm interested in, such as effort, or we could take something that's applicable to you guys as sports therapy students, pain. Obviously, this is a subjective internal experience that individuals have, and we could go about investigating this from either qualitative or quantitative methodologies. So we could ask people about their experiences. We can ask them to describe their experiences in words to us. What is it like? Or we could ask them to, for example, rate their experiences on some numerical scale. Now, inherently asking them to rate their experiences on some numerical scale assumes that we think this is a quantitative variable. That is to say that you can have more or less of it, and what we mean by more or less of it relates to one another in what would be considered an ordered and additive relation. We'll describe this more when we cover measurement theory specifically. But it highlights the fact that just because we're, for example, looking at a subjective phenomena does not necessarily mean that we have to utilise only qualitative methods to understand it. We can use quantitative methods as well. Conversely, if we're looking at objective phenomena, there's no reason again why we can't use either qualitative or quantitative phenomena. For example, if we say are observing an athlete and we are trying to draw inferences about their behaviour, and we said at a particular time they jumped. Well, that is a qualitative description. We are saying that they exhibited some quality that we call jumping, or throwing, or kicking a ball, or whatever, or they sprinted. But we could also look at that quantitatively as well. We can say, well, they jumped, but how high did they jump, or how far did they throw the ball, or how fast did they run? So again, just because the phenomena is either subjective or objective in nature does not necessarily mean that we are limited to only using qualitative or quantitative methods. The dichotomy here isn't as strict as it is typically portrayed to students.